I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President, we welcome to participate in today's meeting the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the Director General of the FAO, Chu Dong-yu, and the Executive Director of the UN World Food Programme, David Beasley. We thank them for their reports. We also note the participation in our meeting of a great number of distinguished representatives of various states. Colleagues, recently, the most obvious trend in the evolution of the political culture in Western states has been the effort to blame Russia for everything. Since the beginning of our special military operation in Ukraine, we have noted a quantum leap in the messages suggesting that Moscow is guilty of everything. The stories connected with food security have been one of the main areas of accusation leveled at Russia. Today's meeting is an eloquent illustration of this. In listening to you, gentlemen, it would seem to be that we want to starve everyone to death and that only you and Ukraine allegedly care about how to save the lives of the hungry. The picture might be a pretty one, but it's an absolutely false one. Let us recall that the threats to world food crisis didn't arise this year, and the possibility of hunger on a biblical scale and a perfect storm were mentioned by a participant in today's meeting, namely the Executive Director of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, in 2020. At that time, 155 million people in 55 countries were at threat of food security problems, and among the reasons given for that were conflict, extreme weather events, and economic turmoil. We regret the fact that our colleagues from the Western members of the Security Council didn't dare to comment on the root causes of the food and other crises in countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, or Syria. Estimates of the number of people potentially at risk of hunger today are of 193 million people. On the 10th of May, on behalf of the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance, the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Rebecca Greenspan, said that there weren't problems with the physical deficit of food, but the issue was the system of its distribution. Experts on the grain market added that a factor here is also the rapid price increases, and that's not a new thing. According to data from stock markets, the year-on-year growth in the price of grain in 2021 alone, for wheat this is, came to 25%. And by February of this year, prices were 60% higher than the average line for the last 5 years. Among the reasons for this situation, leading experts first and foremost indicated the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of disruption to the supply chains, as well as threats or more expensive freight and insurance. There was also the issue of the anti-crisis financial investment in the economies. Thus, the United States, the EU, and Japan spent more than $8 trillion. And that drove up demand and led to a rise in inflation. Against this background, we also have the trade wars that had come into being and the long-standing conflict in the regulation of the agricultural markets. As a result, food stocks or the stored stocks of food were at the lowest levels for the last 5 to 10 years, which drove up food prices and also related costs. Western countries, however, also arrogated to themselves all of the trade flows, which worsened a situation that was already difficult for developing countries dependent on imports. There's an important factor here, and that is the very rapid transition to green energy that's being forced on the whole world instead of a thought-out gradual energy transition, and also the open politicization of energy cooperation in a number of countries. The outcome then is the unreasonable rejection of energy projects and the increase in the price of energy products. The price for oil on stock markets in 2020 to 2022 increased by more than 22%. And that means gas oil for agricultural machines, it means petrol for transporting agricultural products, and it also covers electricity for the food industry. There was also a record increase in the price of gas. In December 2021, the spot price of gas crossed the psychological barrier of $2,000 for 1,000 cubic meters. And this is despite the fact that Russia had increased its supply. The direct consequence of this was the unprecedented increase in prices for mineral fertilizers as early as 2021 in December. The prices for urea and nitrates increased by 3.5-fold, and for other forms of fertilizer by 2.5 to 3-fold. There was also an increase in the price of fertilizer, and that means an increase in the price of grain. A significant part of the problem was the speculation on Western futures markets on food products, which also led to an increase in the prices of commodities, including wheat, maize, and pulses. In addition, we also shouldn't forget about the difficult weather situation in the recent years, for example, in the United States, Canada, Australia, and France. In a nutshell, then, however you might want to look at things, none of these factors were Russia's fault. But these factors did lay the foundation for the current situation in agricultural markets. Nonetheless, we won't hear about these issues in the statements from our Western colleagues almost at all. And of course, they won't mention the unilateral illegal economic sanctions that have affected a range of countries. Everything that they've harped on about today suggests that they think that the special military operation in Ukraine by Russia is threatening the whole world with hunger. But everything that happened before that and that I've mentioned, according to the logic of our Western colleagues, simply amounts to nothing and doesn't play any role. It is clear that this kind of barefaced lying and fabricating might have an effect on an unsuspecting public, but certainly not on serious experts. It is true, the truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that you are distracted by your futile attempts to break the back of the Russian economy at all costs and to isolate our country. I'm not talking here about the inevitable destructive consequences for your own economies. Ultimately, we cannot do anything about your maniacal endeavor to shoot yourself in the foot or even in both feet. The consequences of these policies in your internal markets are something you'll have to answer for to your own taxpayers and your own voters. What I'm talking about here is that in the context of this active proxy war that you have inflated with Russia in Ukraine, then in essence what you're doing is you're taking hostage the whole of the developing world and you are pushing it towards hunger. And whatever you say here today, in terms of changing this situation, you are the only ones who can do that, and I will explain why. You assert that allegedly we are preventing agricultural products from being taken out of Ukraine by sea. However, the truth is that it is Ukraine and not Russia that continues to hold in the ports of Nikolaev, Kherson, Chernomorsk, Mariupol, Achakov, Odessa, and Yuzhny 75 foreign vessels from 17 countries. And it is Ukraine that has also mined the waters. In this case, how can we talk about getting grain out of the country? The Russian armed forces every day are trying to open humanitarian corridors which represent a safe path for the movement of vessels to the southwest from the territorial waters of Ukraine. Kiev, however, continues to try and worm out of working with the representatives of foreign states that are the owners of these vessels in attempting to get these blockaded vessels out into the waters and to the regions where harvests are taking place. There's also a danger for navigation and for the infrastructures in the terms of unmoored Ukrainian mines along the borders of the Black Sea. Russia is doing all that it can to guarantee safe civilian sailing in the Black Seas and the Sea of Azov. This information is something that we also communicate to UN leadership every day. Ukraine, however, as you see, is not undertaking such efforts. And it is clear that without resolving this issue, we cannot talk about exporting grain from Ukraine by sea. In these conditions, a positive role could be played by deliveries of agricultural products and fertilizers from Russia and Belarus. However, there is another artificial problem for us in terms of trying to export, which is also caused by Western countries, and that is the illegal, unilateral, coercive measures they have applied to both countries. They have damaged the agricultural sector, and they had done that even before the events in Ukraine. But after the 24th of February, what we saw was an absolute bacchanal against our country alone. Today, so far in total, there are more than 10,000 sanctions. The result of this is that transport routes have been cut off. There's a logistical crisis. There are threats to Russian ships and they can't get out of ports. There's also a problem with freight and insurance, limits on international commercial accounts. This isn't even a full list. The difficulties with banking, however, are particularly affecting not just the vulnerable private importers, but also humanitarian agencies. You've heard that even the World Food Programme is feeling the effects of what's going on. And this is not to mention the continuing sanction threats which are destabilizing the Western, or the sanctions that are disturbing the energy sector. There's no point referring to sanctions exemptions that have appeared because Western farmers are dependent on Russian and Belarusian fertilizers. Banks and companies that are scared of the government sanctions are forced to over-comply. And what that means is it delays or even cuts off transactions. International experts, including analysts from the FAO, also see other risks coming from sanctions, including potential difficulties with deliveries of agricultural products to Russia, which might then have an effect on future harvests. Having said all this, I'd like to say very responsibly that our country continues to be a responsible supplier of both food and of energy resources. Secretary of State Blinken mentioned Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy president of the Security Council, and said that, well, he left out the fact that Dmitry Medvedev didn't talk about food deliveries to unfriendly sections, but he was talking about those who are suffering from food security. These are the countries we continue to deliver to. These are the ones that Dmitry Medvedev was talking about. This year, we have seen a record harvest of wheat. In this connection, from the 1st of August to the end of the year, we can offer 25 million tons of wheat for export through the port of Novorossiysk. We can also discuss other deliveries, including the fact that from June to December, the potential for fertilizer for export is no less than 22 million tons. But if you don't want to remove your sanctions of choice, then why are you accusing us of causing this food crisis? Why is it that, as a result of your irresponsible geopolitical games, the poorest countries and regions should suffer? In these conditions, attempts to lay the accusations at our door aren't just absurd, but they're blasphemous. I'd like to ask David Beasley, what is the situation with deliveries through the WFP of Russian foods and its delivery to the countries that need it in the context of the sanctions? I also have to address the situation with Ukrainian wheat. According to the data from Ukrainian media itself, even before the beginning of the Russian special military operation in the country, 60 to 90% of its export potential for 2021 to 22 in the marketing year that depended on agriculture had already been carried out. Having said that, the majority of the wheat, some 13 million tons, was carried across the border by the end of 2021. Which, according to data from the Ukrainian press, caused the shortage and then the increase in the prices of bread. There should have been also greater supplies or greater stores of maize, but the main purchasers weren't countries on the verge of food insecurity, but rather states from the European Union that buy more than a third of the volume. In this context, the calls that we've seen from Western officials to increase the exports from Ukraine, honestly, they give rise to some bewilderment on our part. It's clear that the situation with hunger in Ukraine should be bracketed. This is something that the Kiev authorities should think about. But there's another logical question, which is that where do these deliveries go and what relation do they have to food insecurity in the world? Once again, I'd like to ask David Beasley, have the humanitarian deliveries of Ukrainian grain through the World Food Line taken place this year since February? As far as we know, they haven't. But grain, if you believe the statements of Western politicians and data from the media, are being carried out of Ukraine actively using railways and using barges on the Danube. But where is this grain going? We have reason to suspect that this grain is not being used to feed the hungry in the global south, but is being stored in grain storages of a number of different European countries. Thus, as we understand it, Ukraine is paying for deliveries of Western weapons in this way. Something also happened in the history of Ukraine in February 1918. According to an agreement with the government with its central Rada, German and Austrian troops came into Ukrainian territory allegedly to defend it from Soviet Russia. In exchange, Kiev committed to delivering to Berlin and Vienna foods, and as a result, some 37,000 wagons of supplies were exported. I would be grateful if our Western colleagues, first and foremost the United States and the European Union, could comment on this version of grain for weapons. which many experts are talking about, if they could publicly reject that claim, and also if they could at the same time explain how these deliveries help to anchor the global food security. In conclusion, I'd like to comment on two statements from the Secretary of State. He accused Russia, in terms similar to the siege of Leningrad, of blockading Mariupol and causing hunger there. There is a great number of witnesses, of citizens of Mariupol themselves, that saying that their food was taken away, according to fascist tradition, by the Azov battalion. We are trying to help the Syrian people, but our opponent didn't hear what we were doing. And the last thing, the United States is calling for collective action, and mentioned yesterday's meeting of ministers on the food crisis. This is very illustrative, and it illustrates the United States' attempt, instead of having a unilateral measure, to form a coalition on interests where the situation is resolved by the United States, rather than looking at a solution for all. Thank you.
In my capacity as president, and the rules of protocol require that I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement.